The transport ship Mercy's Edge shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace above Xerion Prime. Through the reinforced viewport, Marine Sergeant Jake Bulldog Morrison watched the planet's crimson surface grow larger. Red dust storms swirled across massive continents like angry wounds on the world's face. This wasn't going to be a vacation. First time seeing a Xerion world, Sarge? Asked Private Chen, nervously checking his pulse rifle for the 10th time since they'd left Earth's orbital station. The kid was green, fresh out of boot camp and scared out of his mind. Jake couldn't blame him. Nope, Jake replied, unwrapping a protein bar and taking a bite. The artificial strawberry flavor was terrible, but calories were calories. Been to 3 of their colonies before. They're all the same. Red dirt, thin air, and creatures that want to eat your face off. The Xerion Empire controlled 47 star systems and had been humanity's greatest threat for the past decade. Their warriors were massive scaled beasts that stood 12 feet tall and could tear through steel with their bare claws. They called themselves the apex predators of the galaxy and had conquered every species they'd encountered. Every species except humans. Captain Rodriguez's voice crackled through the ship's comm system. All Marines prepare for deployment. Intelligence reports indicate Emperor Vrextel himself is planetside. This is our chance to end this war. Jake finished his protein bar and checked his gear. Standard Marine kit, pulse rifle, plasma grenades, combat knife, and his lucky flask filled with coffee from Earth. The flask had been with him through 6 major battles, and he wasn't about to leave it behind now. The ship's artificial gravity shifted as they entered the planet's atmosphere. Through the speakers, they could hear the pilot cursing as he navigated through the defensive fire. Bright flashes of enemy plasma cannons lit up the viewport like deadly fireworks. One shot came close enough that Jake could feel the heat through the ship's hull. "They're really rolling out the welcome mat," muttered Corporal Williams, a veteran with more scars than sense. He'd served with Jake on Kepler 442b, where they'd held off a Xerion assault for 3 days with nothing but determination and a lot of explosives. The ship touched down with a bone-jarring thud that sent several Marines stumbling. Jake kept his feet, years of experience having taught him how to ride out rough landings. Outside, he could hear the distinctive roar of Xerion warbeasts. They sounded hungry. "Remember," Jake called out to his squad as they prepared to disembark, "these lizards might be big and scary, but they bleed just like anything else. Keep your heads, watch each other's backs, and we'll all go home with good stories to tell." The cargo bay doors opened with a hydraulic hiss, and immediately the smell hit them. Xerion Prime smelled like sulfur, ozone, and something that reminded Jake unpleasantly of a slaughterhouse. The air was thin but breathable, though it made everyone's voices sound slightly different. They stepped out onto a battlefield that looked like something from humanity's worst nightmares. The ground was littered with the wreckage of previous battles. Twisted metal from destroyed vehicles mixed with the bleached bones of various alien species that had fallen to Xerion might. In the distance, massive spires of black stone reached toward the angry red sky, marking Xerion cities. "Movement, 2 o'clock, shouted Private Martinez, raising his rifle. Through the swirling dust, shapes were approaching. Large shapes with glowing eyes and sharp teeth. The first wave of Xerion warriors emerged from the dust storm like demons from hell. They stood on powerful hind legs, their scaled bodies rippling with muscle. Their heads were elongated like ancient Earth reptiles, but with intelligence gleaming in their yellow eyes. Each one carried weapons that looked like they could punch holes through tank armor. "Fire!" Jake commanded, and the Marines opened up with everything they had. Pulse rifle beams cut through the air, striking the advancing Xerions. Some stumbled, some fell, but more kept coming. These weren't just mindless beasts. They moved with tactical precision, using cover and coordinated attacks. A Xerion warrior broke through their defensive line, its massive claws reaching for Private Chen. Jake moved without thinking, tackling the kid out of the way and putting 3 pulse rifle round center mass into the alien. Green blood splattered across the red dirt as the creature collapsed. "Thanks, Sarge," Chen gasped. But Jake was already moving to the next threat. The battle raged for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. When the dust settled, 15 Xerion warriors lay dead, and the Marines had suffered only minor casualties. But Jake knew this was just the beginning. They were in the heart of enemy territory now, and word of their arrival would spread fast. "Sergeant Morrison," came a voice from behind him. Jake turned to see Lieutenant Foster, the mission commander, approaching with a grim expression. Foster was career military, A by-the-book officer who'd earned his rank through careful planning rather than battlefield heroics. We've received new intelligence from orbit, Foster continued. Emperor Vrexthul isn't just on this planet. He's in the capital city less than 50 kilometers from here. Command wants us to push forward and attempt capture or elimination. Jake looked around at his Marines. They were good soldiers, but they were also tired, low on supplies and deep in enemy territory. 50 kilometers through hostile terrain against an enemy that knew every rock and cave on this world. It was either the best opportunity they'd ever get or a suicide mission. Probably both. What about reinforcements? Jake asked. Negative. The orbital defense grid is too strong. We're on our own until the fleet can break through. Jake nodded and took another swig from his flask. The coffee was still warm somehow. All right, Marines, he called out. Pack it up. We're going hunting. As they prepared to move out, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger than a simple assassination mission. The Xerians were many things, but they weren't stupid. If Emperor Vrexthul was really here, it was for a reason. And that reason probably involved a lot more dead humans before this day was over. But that was a problem for future Jake. Right now, he had a job to do. The march across Xerion Prime's wasteland was like walking through a fever dream. The red sand shifted constantly under their boots, making every step uncertain. Above them, 3 suns burned in the alien sky, their combined heat turning the Marines' armor into mobile ovens. Jake had been in desert combat before, but this was something else entirely. Water break, Jake called out after they'd covered 15 kilometers. His squad dropped gratefully into whatever shade they could find behind the twisted metal remains of some ancient battle. The wreckage was everywhere on this world, like a museum of galactic warfare scattered across an endless desert. Private Chen was looking pale despite the red light filtering through the atmosphere. Sarge, how do they live in this heat? It's got to be over 60 degrees Celsius. Jake pulled out his scanner and checked the readings. 63 degrees, actually. But remember, kid, they evolved here. This is paradise compared to what their ancestors crawled out of. He pointed to a distant mountain range where heat shimmer made the air dance. Intelligence says those mountains used to be volcanoes. Active ones. The whole planet was basically hell until about 1 million years ago. Corporal Williams wiped sweat from his face and grimaced. No wonder they're so mean. I'd be angry too if I grew up in an oven. That got a few chuckles from the squad, but Jake noticed how forced they sounded. The heat was getting to everyone, and they were only a third of the way to their target. He'd have to watch for heat exhaustion symptoms. Movement ahead, whispered Private Martinez from his position on a small ridge. Looks like a patrol. 6 contacts heading our way. Jake crawled up beside him and peered through his scope. 6 Xerian warriors were moving in a standard search pattern, their reptilian heads swiveling back and forth as they scanned for threats. These weren't the frontline fighters they'd faced at the landing zone. These were scouts, smaller, faster, and probably smarter. They haven't spotted us yet, Jake murmured. Williams, take Martinez and circle around to the left. Chen and Foster, you're with me. We'll wait until Williams is in position, then hit them from 2 sides. The ambush went perfectly. The Xerians never knew what hit them. 6 pulse rifle beams found their targets almost simultaneously, and 6 alien bodies hit the sand. But as they approached to check the bodies, Jake's scanner started beeping frantically. Shit, he muttered, looking at the readings. They were broadcasting. Command post knows we're here now. Lieutenant Foster moved up beside him. How long do we have? Depends how far away their response team is. Could be 10 minutes, could be an hour. Jake looked back at his exhausted Marines. Either way, we can't stay here. They pushed harder now, knowing that stealth was no longer an option. The landscape gradually began to change as they approached the capital. The endless red desert gave way to rocky outcroppings and strange crystalline formations that jutted from the ground like frozen lightning. Some of them hummed with energy, and Jake's scanner picked up high levels of exotic radiation. Those crystals, Foster said, pointing at a particularly large formation. Intelligence briefings said they're part of the Xerion power grid. They channel geothermal energy from deep underground. Jake studied the crystals with professional interest. Meaning if we blow them up, we might take out power to parts of the city. Meaning if we blow them up, we might get fried by exotic radiation, Williams countered. I've seen what that stuff does to human tissue. It's not pretty. Before anyone could respond, the ground began to shake. Not an earthquake. Something rhythmic like massive footsteps. And getting closer. Everyone down, Jake hissed. and the Marines dove for cover behind the crystal formations. Through his scope, Jake watched the horizon and tried to identify the source of the vibrations. What he saw made his blood run cold. It was a Xerion war beast, but unlike anything in the intelligence briefings. The creature stood at least 30 feet tall, with 6 powerful legs and a head that looked like a cross between a crocodile and a nightmare. Riding on its back was a howdah filled with Xerion warriors, and Jake could see the distinctive golden armor that marked them as elite guard. "Holy mother of," whispered Chen, staring at the approaching monster. "Emperor's personal guard," Foster said grimly. "That means we're getting close." The war beast stopped less than 100 meters from their position. Jake could smell it now, a mixture of sulfur, musk, and something that reminded him of rotting meat. The creature's head swiveled back and forth, and Jake realized it was sniffing the air. One of the riders barked something in the Xerion language, and the beast's head turned directly toward their hiding spot. Glowing yellow eyes the size of dinner plates fixed on their position. "It can smell us," Jake realized. "Everyone prepare to move. When I give the signal, we scatter and regroup at Rally Point Alpha." But before he could give the order, something unexpected happened. The war beast suddenly reared back on its hind legs, letting out a bone-shaking roar, not at the Marines, but at something else entirely. From behind a nearby crystal formation, another shape emerged. This one was even larger than the war beast, moving on 4 legs with the fluid grace of a natural predator. Its scales were darker, almost black, and when it opened its mouth, Jake could see rows of teeth that would make a great white shark jealous. 2 of them, Martinez breathed. "We're caught between 2 of them." But Jake was watching more carefully and something didn't add up. The riders on the first beast were shouting and raising their weapons, but not at the Marines. They were aiming at the second creature. "Wait," he said quietly. "I don't think they're working together." The 2 beasts circled each other like prehistoric gladiators, their massive forms creating small dust storms with every step. The riders on the first beast opened fire with plasma weapons, but their shots seemed to bounce harmlessly off the second creature's scales. Then the second beast charged. The collision was like watching 2 mountains crash into each other. The impact sent shockwaves through the ground that knocked the Marines flat. When the dust cleared, the first war beast was on its side, green blood pooling in the sand. The riders were scattered, some clearly dead, others struggling to stand. The victor turned toward the Marines, and Jake got his first clear look at its face. This wasn't just a war beast. This was something else entirely. Something older, wilder, and infinitely more dangerous. Scars covered its hide like a road map of ancient battles, and when it looked at them, Jake saw an intelligence that was both alien and disturbingly familiar. It was a predator looking at potential prey, but there was something else in those eyes, something that might have been curiosity. "Nobody move," Jake whispered. Nobody even breathed loud. The creature took a step closer, then another. Its nostrils flared as it tested their scent. Jake could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, but he forced himself to remain perfectly still. Then, impossibly, the creature turned away. It began feeding on the fallen war beast, tearing chunks of flesh with casual efficiency. The surviving Xerion riders scrambled away into the desert, apparently having no desire to challenge this apex predator. "What the hell just happened?" Foster whispered. Jake wasn't sure, but he had a suspicion. "I think," he said slowly, "we just met the local wildlife. And I don't think it likes the Xerions any more than we do." The creature finished its meal and padded away into the crystal formations, leaving the Marines alone with the wreckage. As they cautiously emerged from cover, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Not by enemies, but by something that might, under different circumstances, be an ally. The capital city was still 30 kilometers away, and Emperor Vrexthul was waiting. But maybe, just maybe, they weren't walking into this fight completely alone. The Xerion capital city of Vorthak rose from the red desert like a massive black tumor. Obsidian spires twisted into the sky, connected by bridges that defied gravity through alien engineering. Even from 20 kilometers away, Jake could see the energy barriers that protected the city, shimmering walls of force that could vaporize anything that tried to pass through without authorization. "How the hell are we supposed to get through that?" Private Chen asked, lowering his binoculars with a discouraged expression. Jake studied the defensive grid through his own scope. The barriers weren't continuous. They flickered in patterns, probably cycling power to different sections to prevent overload. There, he said, pointing to the eastern approach. See how the barrier flickers every 30 seconds? That's our window, Lieutenant Foster frowned. 30 seconds isn't much time to cross a kilometer of open ground, which is why we're not going through the front door, Jake replied. He'd been thinking about this problem since they'd first spotted the city. The Xerians were proud warriors, but they were also predictable. They expected their enemies to come at them head-on, matching strength against strength. We're going underground. Williams raised an eyebrow. Underground? Sarge, this planet's crust is mostly volcanic rock. The tunnel system would be a nightmare. Exactly why they won't expect it. Jake pulled out a geological survey map that intelligence had provided. These lava tubes run all through this area. Some of them pass right under the city. The descent into the tube system was like climbing down into the planet's throat. The walls were smooth volcanic glass that reflected their flashlight beams in strange patterns. The air was thick and humid, carrying the smell of sulfur and something else Jake couldn't identify. It reminded him of the reptile house at the zoo, but magnified 1,000 times. After 2 hours of crawling through increasingly narrow passages, they emerged into a vast underground chamber. Jake's flashlight beam couldn't reach the ceiling, and when he dropped a small stone, it took nearly 10 seconds to hit bottom somewhere in the darkness below. This place gives me the creeps, Martinez muttered, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space. Stay focused, Jake replied, but he had to admit the kid had a point. There was something unsettling about this place that went beyond simple claustrophobia. It felt ancient, like they were walking through the bones of some prehistoric giant. They found the tunnel that led toward the city center on a ledge halfway up the chamber wall. The passage was barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and Jake had to suppress a wave of claustrophobia as they squeezed through the tight space. Behind him, he could hear Chen breathing hard, probably fighting the same battle. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, they saw light ahead. Not the artificial glow of their flashlights, but the orange flicker of flame. Jake motioned for silence and crept forward to investigate. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one smaller but clearly artificial. Carved stone walls were covered with symbols that hurt Jake's eyes to look at directly. In the center of the chamber, a massive fire pit burned with flames that cast no smoke but seemed to consume the very air around them. And standing beside the fire, as if he'd been waiting for them, was Emperor Vrexthul. The Xerian ruler was even more imposing in person than in the intelligence photos. He stood nearly 15 feet tall, his scales black as midnight and polished to a mirror shine. Golden armor covered his vital areas, but Jake could see that it was more ceremonial than practical. This wasn't a creature that needed protection. He was protection. Human warriors, Vrexthul said in perfect English, his voice like distant thunder. I have been expecting you. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his pulse rifle, but he forced himself to remain calm. This could be a trap, but something about the Emperor's posture suggested otherwise. There was no aggression in his stance, only a predator's casual confidence. Your Majesty, Lieutenant Foster said formally, clearly falling back on diplomatic protocol. We are here under orders from Earth Command to capture or kill me. Vrexthul interrupted with what might have been amusement. Yes, I'm aware of your mission, just as I am aware that your fleet is currently engaged with my forces in orbit, and that you have no hope of extraction should this meeting go poorly. Jake stepped forward, deciding that honesty might work better than diplomacy. Then why are we talking instead of fighting? The Emperor's head tilted slightly, studying Jake with eyes that gleamed like molten gold. An excellent question, Sergeant Morrison. Perhaps because fighting you would serve no purpose beyond satisfying my warrior's bloodlust. And I have grown weary of pointless bloodshed. Since when do Xerians grow weary of bloodshed? Williams asked skeptically. Vrexthul's mouth opened in what Jake realized was probably a smile, revealing teeth that could bite through steel. Since we encountered your species, Corporal Williams, for 3,000 years we conquered every race we met. Some fought bravely, others surrendered quickly, but all eventually fell to our might. Until we found Earth. Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground air. What are you saying? I am saying that in 10 years of warfare, humans have taught us something we had forgotten. The Emperor moved closer to the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows across his scales. What it means to face an equal opponent, Foster frowned. Equal? Your forces outnumber ours 50 to 1. Numbers mean nothing. Vrexthal replied dismissively. The Kthara Collective had numbers. The Zentari Empire had numbers. We slaughtered them all within months of first contact. But humans... He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Humans fight like us, not just with weapons and tactics, but with the soul of predators. Jake was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading, and he didn't like it. What do you want from us, one? The Emperor laughed, a sound like rock slides. I want nothing from you, human. I offer something to you. An alliance. The chamber fell silent, except for the crackling of the eternal flames. Jake looked at his squad and saw his own shock reflected in their faces. An alliance with the Zerion Empire was so far beyond their mission parameters that they might as well have been asked to negotiate with a solar storm. An alliance against what? Foster asked carefully. Vrexthal turned away from the fire and looked directly at Jake. Tell me, Sergeant, what do you know of the Void Walkers? Jake had never heard the term before, but something about it made his skin crawl. Nothing. They come from the space between galaxies, the Emperor said quietly. Ancient beyond measure, hungry beyond comprehension. They devour entire star systems, leaving nothing but empty space in their wake. My scouts detected their approach 6 months ago. And you didn't warn anyone? Chen asked incredulously. Warn them of what? That death itself was coming to visit? Vrexthal's eyes burned brighter. No species we had encountered possessed the strength to stand against such an enemy. But then my warriors brought me reports from our battles with Earth forces. Stories of humans who fought impossible odds and somehow prevailed. Of Marines who held defensive positions against overwhelming numbers simply because retreat was not acceptable. Jake felt a strange mixture of pride and terror. You think humans and Zerians together could stop these Void Walkers? I think, the Emperor said slowly, that separately we will both be consumed. Together we might have a chance. He gestured toward the carved walls. These symbols tell the story of the last time the Void Walkers came to this galaxy. 3 million years ago, every advanced species united to fight them. It took all of them working together to drive the enemy back to the void. Williams looked at the alien symbols with new respect, and now they're coming back. In 6 standard months, their advanced scout ships will reach the outer rim of Zerion space. The main fleet will follow shortly after. Vrexthal moved closer to the humans, his massive form radiating heat like a furnace. I propose an immediate ceasefire between our peoples. Joint task forces, shared technology, combined military operations. Everything we need to prepare for what is coming. Jake's mind was racing. This was so far above his pay grade that he couldn't even see the stratosphere. But he also knew that decisions made in moments like this could determine the fate of entire civilizations. I'll need to contact Earth Command, Foster said. Of course, Vrexthal agreed. But while we wait for your leaders to debate and politic, perhaps Sergeant Morrison would join me for a more immediate discussion. I believe we understand each other in ways that politicians never could. Jake looked at the Emperor and saw something he recognized. Not a monster or an alien dictator, but a soldier who had seen too much war and was desperately searching for a way to protect his people. It was a look Jake had seen in his own mirror more than once. All right, he said. Let's talk. Emperor Vrexthal led Jake through a passage that opened into what could only be described as a war room. Holographic displays showed star maps, fleet positions, and tactical analyses that made Earth's best military computers look like pocket calculators. But what caught Jake's attention were the images of the enemy. The Void Walkers looked like someone had taken the concept of nightmare and given it physical form. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but seemed to be made of living shadow with too many joints and appendages that bent in impossible directions. Worse, they appeared to phase in and out of reality, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent. Your first glimpse of our common enemy, Vrexthal said, noticing Jake's reaction. They exist partially outside normal space-time, which makes them nearly impossible to target with conventional weapons. Jake studied the tactical data scrolling alongside the images. Nearly impossible isn't the same as completely impossible. What works against them? Quantum disruptor weapons can damage them, but only if you can predict where they'll solidify. The Emperor manipulated the display, showing a battle scene from 3 million years ago. The Ancient Alliance discovered that the Void Walkers have a weakness. They cannot maintain their phased state while feeding. When they consume matter, they must become fully solid. So the trick is to catch them while they're eating. Jake watched as the display showed ancient warriors of dozens of species coordinating attacks. What do they eat? Brextol's expression darkened. Everything. Planets, stars, space itself. But they prefer sentient life. Something about consciousness provides them with more satisfaction. A chill ran down Jake's spine. How long do we have to prepare? 6 months until their scouts arrive. Perhaps a year before the main fleet. The Emperor pulled up another display showing projected invasion routes. But Sergeant, I must be honest with you. Even with our species united, the odds of survival are less than 30%. Jake had faced bad odds before, but 30% was sobering even for him. What would improve those odds? More allies. The Kethmori Confederacy might join us if convinced. The Silicon Collective has advanced defensive technologies. There are others. Brextol paused, studying Jake carefully. But first we must prove that cooperation between humans and Zarians is possible. What did you have in mind? Before the Emperor could answer, alarms began blaring throughout the complex. Brextol's head snapped up, his predatory instincts immediately alert. Scout ships. Something is wrong. The holographic displays shifted to show orbital surveillance. Jake watched in horror as dark shapes materialized in space above the planet. They weren't following normal physics. One moment empty space, the next moment massive vessels that seemed to absorb light itself. They're early, Brextol growled, his voice carrying a note of something Jake had never expected to hear from a Zarian Emperor. Fear. How early? Jake demanded, but he could already see the answer in the tactical readouts. The Voidwalker scout fleet was descending toward the planet, and their energy signatures were off the charts. 6 months early, Brextol replied grimly, which means either our intelligence was wrong, or something has accelerated their timeline. The first attack came without warning. One of the orbital defense platforms simply ceased to exist, not destroyed but completely erased from reality. Jake watched the sensor readings flatline, showing empty space where a massive military installation had been seconds before. We need to get my people, Jake said urgently. Already done. The Emperor gestured, and Jake saw his squad being escorted into the war room by Zarian guards who looked more protective than threatening. Foster's hand was on his sidearm, but he wasn't drawing it. What's the situation? Foster asked as soon as he saw Jake. The situation is that our war just became a sideshow, Jake replied. We've got bigger problems incoming. The displays showed the Voidwalker ships beginning their descent. There were 12 of them, each one the size of a small moon. As they moved through the atmosphere, reality seemed to bend around them, creating distortion fields that played havoc with both human and Zarian sensor equipment. They're heading for the population centers, Brextol observed. Standard feeding pattern. They'll consume the major cities first, then spread out across the planet. Jake studied the tactical situation. The Zarian fleet was repositioning to intercept, but their ships looked like toys compared to the alien monstrosities. What kind of firepower do you have? Plasma cannons, quantum torpedoes, gravitational mines. The Emperor manipulated the controls, highlighting weapon systems across the fleet. But conventional weapons have limited effectiveness. We need to force them to solidify. How do we do that? Bait, Brextol said simply. Offer them something they cannot resist consuming. Jake didn't like where this was going. What kind of bait? A gathering of sentient minds, the largest concentration of consciousness possible. The Emperor's golden eyes fixed on Jake. A joint human-Zarian ground force working together in perfect coordination. It would be irresistible to them. Foster stepped forward. You're talking about using our people as bait. That's unacceptable. It's not bait if you can fight back, Jake said slowly, pieces of a plan forming in his mind. What if we give them exactly what they want, but make sure they choke on it? Brextol's mouth opened in what Jake was learning to recognize as a predatory smile. Continue. We set up a combined force at the primary spaceport. Make it look like we're trying to evacuate civilians. They come down to feed, but instead of helpless prey, they find the most concentrated firepower this planet can provide. Jake pointed at the tactical display. Your quantum disruptors are pulse rifles, everyone working together to hit them when they solidify. The risk is enormous, Foster pointed out. If this doesn't work, we'll lose both our forces and the civilians we're supposed to protect. If we don't try, we lose everyone anyway, Jake replied. At least this way we go down fighting. Brextol studied the proposed battle plan with professional interest. It could work. My ground forces excel at close combat once the enemy is solid. Your Marines are adaptable and think quickly under pressure. Together we might actually have a chance, Jake finished. The Emperor activated a communication system that connected him to Fleet Command. Orders went out in the Zerion language, but Jake could follow the tactical displays well enough to understand what was happening. Zerion ground forces were being redirected to the spaceport, while the fleet moved to support positions. Your turn, Lieutenant, Jake said to Foster. We need Earth Command to authorize cooperation with Zerion forces. Foster hesitated for only a moment before activating his long-range communicator. Earth Command, this is Alpha Team. Request immediate authorization for joint operations with Zerion military forces. We have a common enemy situation, Code Black. The response took nearly 5 minutes to arrive, but when it came, it was everything they needed. Alpha Team, you are authorized for any and all cooperation necessary to preserve human and allied lives. Command sends reinforcements when possible. Earth Command out. Jake felt a mixture of relief and terror. They had authorization, they had a plan, and they had the most unlikely alliance in galactic history. But they also had less than 2 hours before the Voidwalkers reached the surface. All right, people, Jake said, addressing both his squad and the Zerion officers present. We've got work to do. Time to show these ancient nightmares what happens when predators work together. Emperor Vrexthal rose to his full intimidating height, but when he looked at Jake, there was something that might have been respect in his golden eyes. Today, Sergeant Morrison, we discover whether the galaxy's 2 greatest predator species can become its greatest hope. Outside, the sky was growing dark as alien shapes blotted out the suns. But in the war room, surrounded by former enemies who had become desperate allies, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since this mission began. Optimism. They might be outnumbered, outgunned, and facing an enemy from humanity's worst nightmares, but they weren't alone anymore. And sometimes that made all the difference. The real war was about to begin. The Vorthak Imperial Spaceport had never seen anything like the force that was assembling on its launch pads. Human Marines worked side by side with Zerion warriors, setting up defensive positions and checking weapons that had been designed to kill each other just hours before. Jake watched a Zerion soldier help Private Chen adjust his pulse rifle's targeting system, while Chen showed the alien how to prime human plasma grenades. It was surreal, but it was working. Quantum Disruptor Array is in position, reported Commander Thexval, Vrexthal's top military advisor. The Zerion officer was smaller than the Emperor, but radiated the same predatory confidence. Your people learn quickly, Sergeant Morrison. Jake nodded, watching his Marines coordinate with their new allies. Marines adapt. It's what we do. He paused, studying the alien weapon systems. These quantum disruptors. How much firepower are we talking about? Enough to destabilize molecular bonds at the quantum level, Thexval replied. But only when the target exists fully in normal space-time. Against a phased enemy, they're useless. So we make sure they're not phased when we hit them. Jake looked up at the darkening sky where the Voidwalker ships were growing larger. How long do they stay solid when they feed? Unknown. The ancient records are incomplete. Emperor Vrexthal approached, his armor gleaming despite the artificial lighting. But we know they must maintain solidity for a minimum time to actually consume matter. Perhaps 30 seconds. 30 seconds to kill something the size of a small moon. Jake checked his chronometer. The civilian evacuation is complete. All non-combatants have been moved to the underground shelters, Vrexthal confirmed. Though if we fail here, those shelters will only delay the inevitable. Lieutenant Foster jogged over from where he'd been coordinating with Zerion communications. Long-range sensors show 12 ships breaking atmosphere. ETA 15 minutes. Jake looked around at their combined force. 200 human Marines, 400 Zerion warriors, and enough firepower to level a small city. It should have felt like overkill. Instead, it felt barely adequate. Remember the plan? Jake called out to both humans and Zerions. Let them come down. Let them start to feed on the bait we've set up. The moment they solidify, everything we have goes into the primary target. No holding back. No second chances. The bait was a collection of high-energy transmitters that mimicked the neural patterns of a large gathering of sentient beings. To Voidwalker senses, it would look like thousands of minds clustered together, an irresistible feeding opportunity. Private Martinez pointed skyward. Movement! The first Voidwalker ship descended through the clouds like a piece of the night sky come to life. It was impossible to focus on directly. The eyes wanted to slide away from it as if the mind refused to accept what it was seeing. Where the ship passed, reality seemed to ripple and distort. "Hold positions," Jake ordered, fighting his own instincts that screamed at him to run. "Let it get closer." The ship settled over the spaceport with impossible silence. There was no sound of engines, no displacement of air, just the gradual eclipse of light as something the size of a skyscraper hovered 30 meters above their heads. Then it began to feed. Tendrils of pure darkness extended from the ship's underside, probing for the source of the neural activity they'd detected. When they touched the transmitters, the effect was immediate and terrifying. The metal devices didn't just dissolve, they ceased to exist, leaving behind gaps in reality that hurt to look at. But as the feeding began, the ship solidified. The rippling distortions faded, and for the first time, Jake could see their enemy clearly. It was organic, like some massive parasite grown to impossible size. Its surface was covered in what looked like mouths, each one lined with teeth made of crystallized void. "Now!" Jake roared. Every weapon on the spaceport opened fire simultaneously. Pulse rifles, plasma cannons, and quantum disruptors created a light show that turned night into day. The combined firepower of two species' most advanced weapons technology focused on a single point. The Voidwalker ship shuddered under the assault. Chunks of its bioorganic hull were vaporized, spilling fluids that steamed and writhed on the launch pad. But it didn't die. Instead, it let out a sound that was less heard than felt, a vibration that seemed to come from between dimensions. "It's trying to phase out." Thexaval shouted over the weapon's fire. Jake could see the ship beginning to shimmer again, reality bending around it as it tried to escape back into whatever space it normally occupied. But the feeding tendrils were still extended, still connected to the transmitters. "Williams, demo charges on those transmitters. Keep it anchored." Corporal Williams didn't hesitate. He sprinted across the open ground toward the feeding tendrils, carrying a backpack full of high explosives. Voidwalker feeding appendages whipped toward him, but Zerion warriors provided covering fire, their plasma weapons burning lines through the alien tissue. Williams reached the transmitters and began placing charges. 30 seconds, he called back, but they didn't have 30 seconds. The other Voidwalker ships were descending, drawn by the distress signals of their damaged scout. Jake watched 11 more impossible shapes break through the cloud cover, each one larger than the first. "Secondary targets incoming," Foster reported unnecessarily. Everyone could see the sky filling with alien nightmares. "Charges set," Williams announced, already running back toward friendly lines. "Detonate," Jake ordered. The explosion severed the feeding tendrils and sent the wounded Voidwalker ship tumbling through the air. But Jake's satisfaction was short-lived. The other ships were already beginning their own feeding attempts, probing the spaceport with thousands of dark appendages. "Spread out," Jake commanded. "Give them multiple targets." The combined force scattered across the spaceport, breaking into smaller groups that could provide mutual support while avoiding concentration that would make them easy targets. Jake found himself fighting alongside a Zerion warrior named Kexthar, both of them laying down suppressive fire at feeding tendrils that moved with too much intelligence. "Behind you," Kexthar roared, spinning to engage a tendril that had somehow flanked them. His claws raked across the alien tissue, spilling ichor that burned holes in the metal deck plating. Jake put 3 pulse rifle rounds into the wounded appendage, watching it dissolve into smoke. "Thanks, these things are everywhere." "More ships incoming," Kexthar replied, reloading his plasma rifle with smooth efficiency. "This is just the advance guard." Jake looked up to see the warrior was right. Beyond the 12 ships already attacking, more shapes were materializing in the upper atmosphere. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. This isn't a scouting force, he realized with growing horror. This is an invasion fleet. Emperor Vrexthul's voice crackled over the comm system. "All forces fall back to secondary positions. We cannot hold the spaceport." But even as they began an organized retreat, Jake could see the futility of it. The Voidwalkers weren't just attacking the spaceport, they were attacking everything. Across the city, buildings were simply vanishing as the alien ships fed on matter itself. The very ground beneath their feet was being consumed. "Sarge," Private Chen's voice was tight with panic. "Look at the mountains." Jake turned to see something that defied comprehension. The mountain range that had dominated the horizon was gone. Not destroyed, not collapsed, gone. In its place was an expanding sphere of absolute nothingness that hurt to look at directly. "They're eating the planet," Martinez whispered. "Not if I have anything to say about it," Jake growled, but even he could hear the desperation in his own voice. Then something unexpected happened. From the underground tunnel system they'd used to reach the city, new shapes emerged. The local wildlife, massive predators that Jake had glimpsed during their march, were pouring out of every cave and crevice. And they were attacking the Void Walkers. The native predators were somehow able to interact with the feeding tendrils, their claws and teeth finding purchase where human and Xerion weapons had failed. Jake watched in amazement as a pack of the creatures brought down one of the smaller ships through sheer ferocity. The local fauna, Vrexthol's voice came over the comm, filled with something that might have been hope. They exist partially outside normal space-time as well. That's how they survived on this world for so long. Jake felt a plan forming. It was insane, desperate, and had almost no chance of working. But it was better than watching the planet get eaten. "Emperor," he called out over the tactical channel. "I need every quantum disruptor you have, and I need them modified for maximum overload." "That would create an unstable quantum cascade," Vrexthol replied. "The explosion would tear a hole between dimensions," Jake finished. "Big enough to send these things back where they came from." There was a pause. Then, "It would also destroy everything within a 50-kilometer radius." Jake looked around at the devastation spreading across the planet. "At this rate, there won't be anything left to destroy in another hour." "Do it." As Xerion technicians began the dangerous modifications to their most powerful weapons, Jake couldn't help but smile grimly. He'd come to this planet to capture an emperor. Instead, he'd found an ally, an enemy that threatened all life in the galaxy, and possibly the most spectacular way to save the day in military history. All he had to do now was survive. The quantum disruptor modifications were taking too long. Jake watched Xerion technicians work frantically on the massive weapons, while Void Walker ships continued their systematic consumption of the planet. Entire city districts vanished into nothingness as the alien fleet methodically stripped away reality itself. "How much longer?" Jake demanded, ducking as a feeding tendril swept overhead, close enough that he could feel the temperature drop from its proximity. "The quantum matrix must be perfectly aligned," Chief Engineer Vorthak replied, his scaled hands moving with surprising delicacy over the weapon's control systems. "One miscalculation and the cascade will collapse inward instead of creating a dimensional rift. In other words, we'd create a black hole instead of a portal home for our uninvited guests," Lieutenant Foster translated grimly. "That would be the optimistic scenario," Vorthak confirmed. "The pessimistic scenario involves unraveling the quantum structure of local spacetime." Jake was about to respond when movement caught his eye. One of the native predators, the massive creature they'd encountered during their march, was approaching their position. But it wasn't alone. Behind it came dozens of others, all converging on the spaceport with obvious purpose. "I think we're about to have company," Private Chen observed, raising his pulse rifle uncertainly. But the lead predator did something unexpected. It approached Emperor Vrexthul directly, its massive head lowering in what could only be described as a gesture of respect. The Emperor stood motionless as the creature's glowing eyes fixed on his. "Incredible," Vrexthul breathed. "She's trying to communicate." The predator's head turned toward the modified quantum disruptors, then back to the Emperor. She let out a low rumble that Jake felt in his bones rather than heard with his ears. "She understands," Vrexthul said with growing excitement. "The quantum cascade. She knows what we're attempting." The predator moved to the weapon array and began manipulating components with a precision that stunned the Xerion engineers. Her claws, which Jake had seen tear through armored plating, delicately adjusted quantum field generators with the skill of someone who understood exotic physics better than anyone present. "How is that possible?" Foster asked. "She's been living in partial dimensional overlap for millions of years," Vrexthul replied, watching the predator work with fascination. "She understands quantum mechanics the way we understand breathing." Within minutes, the predator had completed modifications that would have taken the Xerion engineers hours. But her assistance came at a cost. The approach of even more Void Walker ships drawn by the concentration of sentient minds and quantum energy. "Contact." Martinez shouted from his position. 3 more ships inbound bearing 090. Jake looked up to see massive shadows descending through the smoke-filled sky. These ships were different from the others, larger, more organic in appearance, and radiating a malevolent intelligence that made his skin crawl. Command vessels, Vrexthul identified. The Voidwalkers have committed their leadership to this assault. Good, Jake replied, checking his weapon. Kill the head and the body dies. But as the command ships approached, something bizarre happened. The native predators began to change. Their forms shimmered and shifted, becoming more translucent, more alien. Jake realized with growing amazement that they were adapting, shifting into the same dimensional overlap that the Voidwalkers used. They're going to fight on the enemy's level, he breathed. The battle that followed was unlike anything in recorded military history. Native predators phased in and out of reality, engaging Voidwalker feeding tendrils in dimensions that human eyes couldn't properly perceive. Meanwhile, human and Xerian forces provided support fire whenever the enemy solidified enough to be targeted. But the real fight was happening around the quantum disruptors. Voidwalker command ships had identified the weapons as a threat and were focusing their assault on the array. Feeding tendrils by the hundreds descended toward the modified weapons, intent on consuming them before they could be activated. Protective perimeter, Jake ordered. Nothing gets through to those disruptors. The combined force formed defensive lines around the weapon array, pouring everything they had into the approaching tendrils. Pulse rifle beams and plasma cannon bursts lit up the artificial night. But for every tendril they destroyed, 2 more took its place. We can't hold them, Williams shouted, reloading his rifle with practiced speed. There's too many. That's when the Predator who had helped modify the weapons did something extraordinary. She placed her massive form directly in front of the quantum disruptor array and began to glow with an inner light. The energy field that surrounded her seemed to interact with the Voidwalker tendrils, causing them to recoil as if burned. She's creating a quantum barrier, Vorthak explained in amazement, using her own life force as a shield. But Jake could see the cost. The Predator was burning herself out, literally converting her life energy into quantum interference patterns. She was buying them time, but not much. How long until the disruptors are ready? Jake demanded. 2 minutes for full charge, Vorthak replied. We don't have 2 minutes, Foster observed, watching the protective barrier flicker as the Predator weakened. Jake made a decision that went against every tactical manual ever written. Everyone with quantum grenades form up on me. We're going to give these things something else to worry about. He led a suicide charge directly into the heart of the Voidwalker assault. It was madness, but it was effective madness. The sudden concentration of quantum explosives in close proximity to their feeding apparatus caused the command ships to recoil, their tendrils withdrawing defensively. Now, Jake shouted into his comm. Fire everything. The modified quantum disruptors activated simultaneously, their combined output creating a cascade reaction that tore reality like tissue paper. The dimensional rift that opened above the spaceport was visible from space, a wound in the universe itself that pulled at the Voidwalker ships with irresistible force. But the rift was unstable. Jake could see it fluctuating wildly, threatening to collapse before it could banish all of the enemy ships. The dying Predator made one final sacrifice. She channeled the last of her life force into the quantum cascade, stabilizing the rift just long enough for it to do its job. One by one, the Voidwalker ships were pulled into the dimensional portal, their alien forms stretching and distorting as they disappeared into whatever realm lay beyond normal space. The last thing Jake saw before the rift collapsed was the lead command ship, its surface covered with what looked like eyes, all of them focused on him with unmistakable hatred and recognition. Then it was gone, and the portal sealed itself with a sound like the universe sighing in relief. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in hours, the sky was clear of alien nightmares. The city was devastated, vast sections simply missing, but the planet itself was intact. Jake looked around at his Marines and their Xerion allies. They were exhausted, battered, and covered in alien ichor, but they were alive. More importantly, they had won. Emperor Vrexthul approached, his golden armor scorched and dented, but his predatory grace intact. Sergeant Morrison, he said formally, I believe this marks the beginning of a new era for our species. Jake nodded, too tired for elaborate speeches. Just as long as that era involves better intel about when the ancient horrors are planning to drop by for dinner. The Emperor's laugh was like distant thunder, but this time it held warmth instead of threat. Indeed. Perhaps our alliance should begin with improved intelligence sharing. As dawn broke over the wounded planet, Jake realized that everything had changed. The war between humans and Xerians was over, ended not by conquest or surrender, but by the recognition that some enemies were too dangerous to face alone. He pulled out his flask and took a sip of coffee that was somehow still warm. Looking around at the mixed forces beginning the process of securing the area and treating the wounded, he couldn't help but smile. They'd come to capture an emperor and ended up saving a world. Not a bad day's work for a Marine? 3 months later, Jake stood on the observation deck of the joint human-Xerion space station Predators Alliance, watching construction crews from both species work together to complete the galaxy's first interspecies military command center. It still felt surreal, seeing humans and Xerions sharing tools, comparing engineering techniques, and occasionally engaging in what could only be called friendly competition over who could install hull plating faster. Sergeant Morrison, came a familiar voice behind him. Jake turned to see Emperor Vrexthul approaching, but the massive alien ruler looked different now. Less intimidating, more approachable, the kind of change that came from fighting side by side against a common enemy. Your Majesty, Jake replied with a slight nod. They'd established a more informal relationship over the past months, but some protocols were important to maintain in front of the crews. The latest intelligence reports have arrived, Vrexthul said, handing Jake a data pad. Our combined scout fleets have surveyed the Outer Rim territories where the Voidwalkers first appeared. Jake read through the findings with growing unease. The reports detailed entire star systems that had been completely consumed, leaving behind regions of space where matter itself seemed unstable. But more disturbing were the readings from the dimensional barriers between realities. They were weakening. They're coming back, Jake said. It wasn't a question. Eventually, yes. The dimensional rift we created sent them back to their realm, but it also created cracks in the barriers that separate our realities. Vrexthul moved to stand beside Jake at the observation window. Our scientists estimate we have perhaps 5 years before they can break through again in force. 5 years to prepare. Jake watched a human engineer explain plasma welding techniques to a group of Xerion workers. Think it'll be enough? It will have to be. But we will not face them alone this time. The Emperor pulled up a holographic display showing the galaxy. Green markers indicated systems that had joined the new alliance. 17 species have already signed mutual defense agreements. The Silicon Collective has contributed advanced shield technology. The Kethmori have shared their temporal manipulation research. Even the isolationist Zentari remnant has agreed to limited cooperation. Jake studied the tactical display with professional interest. What about military integration? It's one thing to sign papers, another thing to coordinate in battle. That is why you are here, Sergeant Morrison. Vrexthul manipulated the display to show troop deployment patterns. Earth Command has agreed to your reassignment as liaison officer for interspecies military operations. You will be working directly with our combined general staff to develop unified tactics and training protocols. The promotion had come as a surprise, but Jake had to admit it made sense. He'd become something of a celebrity in both human and Xerion military circles after the Xerion Prime incident. More importantly, he'd proven that the two species could work together effectively under pressure. What about my squad? Jake asked. It was the question that mattered most to him. Williams, Chen, Martinez, and Foster had all volunteered to stay with him for this new assignment. They will form the core of the first integrated training unit, human Marines and Xerion warriors learning to fight as a single force. The Emperor paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. There is resistance on both sides. Many of my people still see humans as inferior. Many of your people still see us as monsters. Prejudice dies hard, Jake agreed, but fear of extinction dies harder. When the Voidwalkers come back, species loyalty won't matter. Only survival will. A communication alert interrupted their conversation. The holographic display shifted to show an incoming transmission from the Kethmori homeworld. The alien diplomat who appeared was roughly humanoid, but with crystalline features that reflected light in mesmerizing patterns. Emperor Vrexthul. Sergeant Morrison, the Kethmori began, her voice carrying harmonic overtones that were pleasant to hear. I bring urgent news from the outer territories. What have you found, Ambassador Scythen? Frexthul asked. Our deep space monitors have detected dimensional anomalies in the Kepler sector. Not a full breach, but significant weakening of the barriers. Our scientists believe it may be an advanced probe. The Voidwalkers testing our defenses. Jake felt a familiar tightness in his stomach. 3 months of peace had been nice, but he'd known it wouldn't last. How much time do we have? Unknown. The probe appears to be gathering information rather than preparing for immediate invasion. But, Sergeant, there is something else you should know. Ambassador Scythen's crystalline features shifted in what might have been concern. The probe is showing particular interest in Earth and Zerion Prime, the worlds where you successfully repelled their scouts. They're looking for us specifically, Jake realized. The ones who hurt them. It would appear so. The Voidwalkers have long memories and do not forgive those who cause them pain. Frexthul's expression darkened. We may have earned their special attention. Jake thought about that for a moment. On one hand, it was terrifying to know that ancient cosmic horrors held a personal grudge against him. On the other hand, it meant their desperate gambit on Zerion Prime had actually hurt the enemy enough to matter. Good, he said finally. Let them come looking for us. We'll be ready. The next few weeks were a blur of activity. The first integrated training exercises between human and Zerion forces were conducted on a remote moon in the neutral zone. Jake watched with pride as his Marines worked alongside alien warriors, each side learning from the other's strengths. Private Chen, now promoted to corporal, had become something of an expert on Zerion weapon systems. Jake watched him demonstrating quantum disruptor maintenance to a group of Zerion cadets, using a mixture of basic English and technical gestures that somehow got the point across. Corporal Williams, meanwhile, had taken on the challenge of teaching Zerion warriors about human explosives. His students were enthusiastic, perhaps too enthusiastic. Jake made a mental note to increase the safety protocols after the third training accident that week. But the real breakthrough came when they conducted their first joint live-fire exercise against holographic Voidwalker simulations. The combination of human adaptability and Zerion ferocity, coordinated through shared tactical networks, proved devastatingly effective against the enemy projections. Remarkable, observed General Thaxmore, the Zerion officer in charge of military integration. Your Marines think 3 steps ahead while our warriors fight 3 steps beyond normal limits. Together, they create tactical possibilities neither could achieve alone. That's the idea, Jake replied. Watching the exercise concludes with a flawless coordinated strike that would have made any drill sergeant proud. By the time the Voidwalkers come back, we won't be 2 separate forces cooperating. We'll be one force that happens to include multiple species. A communication alert drew their attention to an incoming priority message from Fleet Command. Jake recognized the voice of Admiral Chen, the human officer coordinating the Alliance fleet operations. All stations, this is Fleet Command. We have confirmed dimensional breach in the Kepler sector. Voidwalker probe ships have entered normal space and are advancing on the Zerion human border. All units prepare for contact. Jake felt the familiar pre-battle calm settle over him. This was what they'd been training for, preparing for, dreading for 3 months. The real test of their alliance was about to begin. Well, he said to Emperor Frexthul, who had appeared at his side, looks like we're about to find out if all this cooperation actually works in practice. The Emperor's golden eyes gleamed with something that was equal parts anticipation and deadly intent. Indeed, Sergeant Morrison. And if it does not work, then we adapt and make it work, Jake finished. That's what predators do. We evolve. As alarms sounded throughout the station and both human and Zerion forces rushed to their battle stations, Jake couldn't help but smile. He'd started this journey as a Marine sergeant on a simple capture mission. Now he was the first human Zerion Alliance military coordinator, facing down cosmic horrors with the strangest collection of allies in galactic history. He pulled out his flask, took a sip of coffee that was somehow still perfect, despite being brewed on a Zerion ship, and headed for the command center. Whatever was waiting for them in the Kepler sector, they'd face it together, just like predators should.